An anonymous email arrives at a local television station demanding millions of dollars in cryptocurrency for the safe return of a missing elderly woman. The person who wrote the email does not actually care about a single cent of that money. Application, but completely lack the basic physical competence required to execute a clean abduction. The investigators must immediately reconcile these two violently conflicting profiles before the trail goes completely cold. They quickly realize they are not dealing with an international mastermind. They are dealing with a massive fraud. Someone is trying incredibly hard to play the specific role of a sophisticated cartel criminal. But their terrifying mask slipped the exact moment the physical violence became real. The blood on the porch is not just brutal evidence of an assault. It is the very first major crack in a carefully constructed illusion. What kind of person can possibly be both a silent digital phantom and a completely panicked amateur desperately waving a gun? As the public and the media frantically focused on the missing woman, the narrative was consumed by the arrival of the alleged ransom demands. These digital communications were sent to news outlets, deliberately fueling a wave of public panic. How does a seemingly perfect ransom demand completely unravel under the clinical lens of modern behavioral science? The emails were chillingly specific. They demanded millions of dollars in untraceable cryptocurrency. They described elements of the house to prove they had access. The city firmly believed an organized syndicate had targeted the family because of their vast wealth and social status. The public perception was entirely hijacked by these electronic letters. It seemed like a clear case of corporate extortion. The kidnappers demanded a massive payday to release a vulnerable target. But behind closed doors, the federal authorities were looking at the exact same text and coming to a violently different conclusion. Seasoned behavioral experts and former federal profilers began dismantling the psychology behind the emails. When these experts applied their clinical knowledge of criminal behavior to the demands, the entire cartel theory collapsed instantly. They unequivocally stated that these letters were nothing more than a carefully constructed smokescreen. Why would a suspect go through the immense physical risk of breaking into a highly secure residence, abducting a medically fragile woman? The ransom demands were a deliberate trap designed to waste police resources and manipulate the daily news cycle. Why were the profilers so absolutely certain that the demands were completely fake? Their conclusion was firmly rooted in the fundamental logic of professional kidnapping operations. A genuine criminal syndicate, motivated by a financial payout, operates exactly like a ruthless business. Their primary objective is to keep the valuable hostage alive long enough to secure the multi-million-dollar transaction. To successfully achieve this, they meticulously select targets who can physically survive the brutal, traumatic conditions of an underground captivity. This core business model makes the violent abduction of an 84-year-old woman with severe cardiac issues completely illogical. Taking a hostage who relies heavily on a remote pacemaker and requires constant, dedicated medical supervision is an absolute operational nightmare for a professional crew. The risk of the highly vulnerable hostage suffering a fatal medical emergency before the cryptocurrency is transferred is astronomically high. A real sophisticated cartel would never gamble millions of dollars on such a physically fragile asset, and sending terrifying written threats to the local media, if they never actually intended to collect the massive payout, they would target a healthier individual or execute a rapid, lucrative burglary while the property was empty. The profilers realized the unknown suspect was actively using the family's immense wealth as a psychological weapon against the local police force. The attacker fully knew that the overwhelmed authorities and the sensationalist media would instantly believe a grand financial motive because it perfectly fit the classic cinematic Hollywood narrative. The terrifying emails were obviously not written to successfully extract a massive cryptocurrency fortune. They were very specifically written to force the regional detectives to look outward toward shadowy, international crime rings, instead of looking closely inward at the immediate surrounding community. The dramatic demands were simply an elaborate piece of deceptive theater meant to thoroughly camouflage a deeply personal, violent attack. The stunning realization that the entire extortion plot was a complete total fabrication sent a massive, undeniable shockwave straight through the heart of the entire official investigation. It fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of the massive manhunt. The answers to these unsettling questions lie hidden in the microscopic details of a physical crime scene that was meticulously staged to tell a deliberate lie. The authorities were officially no longer looking for an organized, violent crew of financially motivated mercenaries. The clinical behavioral analysis definitively proved that the violent attacker did not actually care about the money at all. This horrific event was not a calculated business transaction. It was a highly targeted personal assassination, heavily disguised as a random kidnapping. The suspect forcefully broke into that specific secure house to permanently eliminate that specific vulnerable woman, and they skillfully utilized the local media to completely cover their bloody tracks. This terrifying pivot forces us to deeply confront a much darker psychological reality. If the requested millions of dollars in digital ransom money were entirely irrelevant to the masked attacker, then what was the actual sinister motive actively driving the armed figure caught on the surveillance camera at exactly 2:12 in the morning? We are about to look at the exact forensic details that undeniably prove the photo seeded. Welcome to Ellis Case Reports. Today we are stripping away the digital smokescreen of a high-profile disappearance to reveal the chilling truth hiding underneath the headlines. Hidden suspect was violently acting out a role they were never trained to play. Make sure to hit the like button and leave a detailed comment with your current theories as we systematically break down the disastrous physical mistakes the accused killer made directly on camera. To completely expose the fraudulent nature of the extortion plot, we must conduct a clinical forensic analysis of the 2:12 in the morning security footage. This brief surviving video clip is the only unfiltered physical evidence of the suspect in motion. When federal technicians digitally enhanced the darkened frames, they did not find a highly trained cartel operative. They found an individual aggressively trying to simulate one. The suspect caught on the backup camera was dressed in dark tactical clothing and carried a distinctive Ozark Trail hiker backpack. This specific choice of gear was clearly intended to project a militaristic and highly prepared image. But the physical execution of this persona was a catastrophic failure. We will analyze the distinct forensic contradictions that led seasoned investigators to realize they were not hunting a greedy international syndicate. The most glaring piece of evidence betraying the suspect's lack of professional training was their incredibly awkward handling of the firearm. The weapon used to intimidate the 84-year-old victim was incorrectly holstered at the suspect's waist. A seasoned mercenary, or a genuine enforcer for a major criminal organization, possesses deeply ingrained muscle memory regarding weapon retention. They secure their firearms instinctively because their survival depends on it. The individual on the porch, however, handled the weapon with the clumsy hesitation of an amateur. They clearly possessed the gun, but they lacked any authentic operational experience in carrying it tactically. This single behavioral observation completely shatters the illusion of the hardened professional hitman. The suspect was a heavily armed novice playing a very dangerous game of dress-up. This stunning lack of physical competence was immediately compounded by a second massive tactical error. Despite taking the time to wear thick gloves to prevent fingerprint transfer, and despite possessing the technical knowledge, but a localized predator who was already intimately familiar with their specific target. To strategically blind the primary camera network, the suspect fundamentally failed to secure their facial covering. In the chaotic, frantic moments of physically forcing the elderly victim out the door, the lower half of the attacker's face became completely exposed to the secondary lens. A truly organized professional operating under a multi-million-dollar extortion contract does not simply forget to pull up their mask while standing directly in front of a smart home camera. This critical exposure was not a calculated risk. It was the direct result of sheer absolute panic. The suspect was completely overwhelmed by the terrifying reality of the physical violence they were committing. They were so intensely focused on physically controlling the victim that they completely lost their plan. Situational awareness regarding the surveillance environment they had just spent hours trying to hack. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our deep dives into the complex psychology of deception. This is the ultimate hallmark of a staged crime scene falling apart in real time. The immense psychological pressure of committing an intimate violent act caused the suspect to completely abandon their sophisticated digital persona and revert to terrified amateur mistakes. The physical evidence caught on camera perfectly aligned with the psychological profile constructed from the digital ransom demands. Forensic linguists analyzing the extortion emails noted a very similar pattern of amateur simulation. The specific phrasing used in the demands read like a dramatic script pulled directly from a fictional crime thriller. The unknown author was deliberately using exaggerated, highly aggressive vocabulary to desperately sound like a stereotypical cartel boss. But the underlying structural syntax and the frantic emotional pacing of the emails revealed a distinct lack of actual criminal composure. The suspect was clearly trying far too hard to be intimidating. The bold words typed on the screen were exactly like the improperly holstered gun waving awkwardly on the porch. They were nothing more than theatrical props used to construct a completely fake reality. To understand exactly why the ransom notes are considered a fraudulent trap, we first have to closely examine the highly controlled environment where the victim lived. As seasoned investigators carefully compiled these glaring behavioral inconsistencies, the true sinister nature of the crime became undeniably clear. Every single piece of physical and linguistic evidence loudly screamed that the suspect was desperately trying to deflect attention far away from their true identity. They were not trying to silently disappear into the violent criminal underworld. They were actively trying to seamlessly disappear right back into normal everyday society. The authorities suddenly realized that the clumsy, heavily armed figure caught briefly on tape was highly likely. Someone who had a completely legitimate reason to intimately know the exact layout of the Catalina Foothills residence. The attacker was clumsily attempting to hide a localized, deeply personal, violent motive safely behind the terrifying international mask of a global syndicate. But their deceptive mask had catastrophically slipped, and the unyielding forensic evidence had permanently captured the shocking truth. The alleged suspect was not a digital ghost. They were an amateur, leaving a trail of disastrous mistakes across the concrete steps and servers. It looks exactly like a textbook extortion plot orchestrated by a highly sophisticated criminal syndicate. We must look at the invisible digital fortress that surrounded her daily life and ask a very disturbing question. The investigation was no longer paralyzed by the sheer scale of the fake ransom demands. It was now hyper-focused on identifying the specific individual who possessed both the internal network, access to plan the digital attack, and the immense personal animosity to execute the physical extraction. The protective circle of suspicion was about to tighten dramatically around the very people who claimed to know the elderly victim best. The investigation drifted into a frozen valley of uncertainty as the days turned into weeks without a single verified sighting of the 84-year-old victim. The massive media storm surrounding the million-dollar bounty began to feel like a hollow echo, while the physical search for the mystery hiker hit a brick wall. Law enforcement teams had scoured the desert floor for any discarded tactical equipment, but the landscape refused to yield its secrets. Despite the biological material found on a solitary glove recovered 2 miles away, laboratory results confirmed the DNA did not match any known profile in the national database. How did a complex technological system, specifically designed to keep dangerous strangers out, end up providing the absolute perfect tactical blueprint for a violent midnight abduction? This lack of a criminal record suggested the attacker was someone who had never before crossed paths with the legal system. They were a ghost in the traditional sense, yet they possessed an incredibly modern and sophisticated digital signature. The task force was forced to confront a baffling stalemate. On one side, they had the frantic demands for cryptocurrency, which continued to populate local news inboxes with increasing desperation. On the other side, they had a crime scene that appeared more like a personal vendetta than a business operation. The authorities realized that as long as they chased the shadowy extortionist, they were essentially running in circles inside a maze built by the suspect. To break this cycle, federal analysts decided to stop looking at the physical evidence and start interrogating the invisible infrastructure of the smart home itself. They suspected that the suspect believed they had wiped the digital slate clean by smashing the doorbell camera and disrupting the local router. However, the suspect fundamentally underestimated the nature of modern cloud synchronization. While the localized hardware sat destroyed, the telemetry data from that January evening had already been silently transmitted to a series of remote backend servers. Nancy Guthrie's life was dictated by continuous remote medical monitoring. These servers did not just record video, they archived every single internal query made within the home network. Every time a specific device was toggled, and every time a security protocol was bypassed, the central system logged the exact millisecond of the event. This hidden log was about to become the most dangerous witness in the history of the case. By pulling the unedited digital history directly from the corporate headquarters, federal agents could finally see the true sequence of the breach without the distortion of the suspect's staging efforts. They were searching for a specific digital thumbprint that would prove the intruder knew exactly where to look before they ever stepped onto the porch. The tension was building toward a revelation that would rewrite the entire narrative of the abduction. The detectives were no longer looking for a kidnapper. They were looking for an admin. The answer was not in the desert. It was buried in the code. The breakthrough occurred when the recovered cloud metadata revealed a stunning and undeniably surgical strike against the medical monitoring system. She was 84 years old and relied on an advanced remote pacemaker application to keep her heart connected to an external medical network. The logs proved that the suspect did not just disable the general house alarm. Instead, they issued a direct command to the specific IP address associated with the remote pacemaker application a full hour before the cameras were touched. This was the peak of the investigation because it proved beyond any scientific doubt that the attacker possessed an intimate knowledge of the victim's medical internal settings. This was not the work of a random hacker or a violent syndicate operative. It was a digital execution conducted by someone who already had the passwords. The behavioral specialists at the FBI analyzed this specific query and concluded that it represented the ultimate proof of crime scene staging. The suspect had meticulously disabled the lifelines that kept Nancy Guthrie connected to emergency services because they never intended for her to be found alive. The extortion letters were merely a theatrical production meant to justify the disappearance of a woman who had already been targeted for elimination. The $1 million demand was a fantasy designed to distract the public, while the perpetrator enjoyed the silence they had created. This technical revelation transformed the entire manhunt into a domestic forensic audit. To protect this fragile existence, her home was transformed into a digital fortress. The person who knew the specific brand and login credentials of a private medical heart monitor was someone who had spent hours inside that residence. The suspect was likely someone who had helped set up the system, or who was regularly trusted to manage the healthcare routines of the 84-year-old victim. The motive was not greed. It was a cold and calculated desire to permanently remove an elderly woman while hiding behind a high-profile media circus. The sophisticated ransom demands were a complete psychological failure because they assumed the police would be too blinded by the celebrity status of the family to notice the technical precision of the medical breach. But the cloud data does not have a bias. It recorded a clinical betrayal that was planned with the same coldness as a software update. The suspect was an insider who used their technical privilege to commit an untraceable murder, cloaked in the dramatic language of a kidnapping. This was the moment the mask fell off. Security cameras monitored the perimeter. The Internet of Things governed the doors and the windows. The investigative teams finally understood that the monster they were hunting was not a stranger with a gun, but a confidant with a keyboard. The true horror of the case was the realization that the person who orchestrated the entire event had likely been standing among the grieving family members all along. The digital evidence had successfully unmasked the traitor, but the battle for legal justice was only just beginning. The resolution of the case began to materialize as the authorities shifted their focus entirely toward the immediate social circle of the victim. By using the recovered cloud logs, they could cross-reference the timing of the network breach with the physical locations of everyone authorized to access the residence. The extortion theory was officially dead, and in its place was a clinical forensic map of an insider hit. The suspect had attempted to use the family wealth as a smokescreen, but the sheer technological precision of the pacemaker hack was their ultimate undoing. It was a detail too specific for a random intruder to ever replicate. As the police began conducting intensive interviews based on the new digital profile, the weight of the evidence started to crush the remaining illusions. This is a crucial detail because an average burglar looks for open windows or unlocked doors. One by one, the false assumptions about international cartels were discarded until only one terrifying possibility remained. The person who knew the heart monitor best was the person with the most to gain from its silence. However, even as the logical trap closed around the primary suspect, a series of unconfirmed questions continued to linger in the minds of the investigators. If the individual caught on camera was a panicked amateur, how did they coordinate such a flawless and remote digital sabotage? The discrepancy between the messy blood on the porch and the clean code in the server logs suggests a potential secondary actor. A silent partner may have been providing the technical support from a safe distance, while the physical suspect was left to handle the violent reality of the abduction. This theory of a collaborative effort explains why the perpetrator felt confident enough to send elaborate ransom letters to the press while failing to even properly holster their weapon. The case remains a haunting example of how a staged crime can almost succeed by weaponizing the public hunger for sensationalist headlines. But the person who targeted Nancy did not look for physical weaknesses. The victim may have been targeted for her vulnerability, but the digital legacy of her home ensured that her final moments would not be forgotten by the justice system. The The suspect thought they were playing a high-stakes game of misdirection, but they were actually leaving a permanent record of their own betrayal. The investigation eventually pivoted into a cold analytical phase, where the primary objective was to secure a conviction that could withstand the scrutiny of a high-profile trial. The cloud data provided the foundation, but the emotional impact of the case would be felt by the community for years to come. This investigation serves as a vital case study in the modern science of identifying crime scene staging. From a forensic perspective, the most important lesson is the inherent dissonance between a suspect's intellectual planning and their physical execution. When an amateur offender attempts to simulate a professional kidnapping, they almost always fail to account for the intense psychological pressure of real-world violence. The clinical precision of a network hack cannot be maintained when a suspect is faced with the visceral resistance of a human target. They looked for network vulnerabilities. Why is this critical for the viewer to understand? This behavioral friction is the exact point where a staged narrative begins to fracture and reveal the truth. What this case teaches us about the evolution of residential security is equally significant. We are moving into an era where our most intimate medical data is tethered to a TANA fiber, digital network that can be exploited by those within our own perimeter of trust. The smart home is designed to repel the stranger, but it is completely defenseless against the authorized user who harbors a hidden malice. This creates a terrifying new landscape for interpersonal conflict, where the tools of care are converted into the tools of an untraceable assassination. The digital fortress provides a perfect map for an insider to navigate, while the family remains blinded by a false sense of security. The forensic reality is that the next generation of predators will not need to pick a lock to destroy a life. They will only need to know the administrative password. The tragic abduction of Nancy Guthrie has fundamentally altered our understanding of what it means to be secure in a digital world. Because breaking into a house is a physical act of force, but breaking into a specific remote pacemaker, the extortion letters, and the tactical gear were nothing more than a desperate performance that was ultimately dismantled by the unyielding memory of a remote server. The blood on the porch told the truth that the suspect tried so hard to bury. We have seen how a masterfully staged crime can be torn apart when behavioral science meets cloud technology. But the shadows of this case still hold many secrets regarding the potential involvement of others in the digital sabotage. If someone you trust has the power to silence your heartbeat with a single click, are you ever truly safe? In our next report, we will explore the terrifying rise of digital domestic warfare and how your own smart devices could be testifying against you in a court of law. Hit the like button and subscribe to Ella's Case Reports to stay ahead of the evidence. The logistical demands are incredibly precise. The physical threats are absolute. Application requires highly specialized knowledge of the exact medical hardware the victim depends on. The architecture of her daily routine was built entirely on automated alerts and constant digital surveillance. Every movement she made was logged by the security system, and every heartbeat was transmitted through the medical portal. This created an overwhelming illusion of absolute safety. Family members and medical professionals could check a screen and instantly verify that she was secure inside her heavily monitored residence in the Catalina foothills. The house was essentially a closed loop, designed to identify and repel external threats immediately. But this dense web of technology contained a fatal psychological blind spot. These systems are incredibly efficient at keeping strangers on the outside. They track unknown faces approaching the porch, and they sound alarms when exterior glass is broken. However, they are completely indifferent to the people who are granted authorized access. An 84-year-old woman has vanished completely into the freezing night. The same cameras that provide peace of mind also silently record the exact daily habits of the homeowner. They document the precise times the victim goes to sleep. They log the exact moments the house is empty. The remote medical applications broadcast real-time updates regarding the physical strength or vulnerability of the patient. The technology was installed to be a protective shield. But if someone with malicious intent manages to step inside that perimeter of trust, the entire system inverts. The protective shield suddenly becomes the most detailed and invasive surveillance tool imaginable. It provides a silent observer with a minute-by-minute breakdown of the victim's life. To execute a precision strike against a medically fragile target, an attacker does not need to hide in the bushes. They just need to understand the network. The terrifying reality of Nancy Guthrie's meticulously monitored life is that the tools designed and the only trace left behind is a digital ransom note promising immediate violence if the massive fortune is not transferred to an untraceable account. To summon help were the exact same tools that could be manipulated to ensure she died alone. A heavily fortified smart home generates a powerful sense of comfort, but that comfort relies entirely on the assumption that the threat will come from a stranger trying to break in from the cold streets. It offers absolutely no protection when the threat has already been invited inside. The cameras and the heartbeat monitors do not recognize betrayal. They simply record the data. And the data from that January night suggests that the person who shattered Nancy Guthrie's world did not have to guess her routine. They already knew it by heart. The illusion of safety evaporates the moment you realize that the most dangerous predators do not always break down the front door. Sometimes they are the ones who already know the specific password required to turn off the alarm. The feeling of security inside a smart home is ultimately a fragile psychological construct. The entire city is gripped by the terrifying reality of the situation. It lulls the occupant into a deep sleep while leaving the digital back door wide open for someone familiar to exploit without making a single sound. The precision of the digital attack stands in stark contrast to the physical reality of the crime scene. The timeline of the breach reveals a terrifying sequence of events that unfolded in the dead of night. At exactly midnight, the very first anomaly registered on the digital grid. The application monitoring the victim's remote pacemaker suddenly lost its signal. There was no physical disturbance reported inside the house. There were no broken windows and no forced locks. The primary system specifically designed to alert medical personnel of a cardiac event was simply silenced. A seasoned investigator looking at this specific detail knows that an average home invader does not start their crime spree by hacking a localized health portal. This requires deliberate intent and highly specific prior knowledge. But when former federal behavioral analysts look at the exact same terrifying message, they do not see a cartel or a professional kidnapping ring at work. Nearly 2 hours pass in complete agonizing silence. Then, at 1:47 in the morning, the physical dismantling of the security perimeter actively begins. The front doorbell camera is aggressively tampered with and physically destroyed. The digital eyes of the property are blinded one by one. The attacker is methodically working their way through the external network, ensuring that no live video feed is broadcasting back to the main security servers. They clearly believe they have completely isolated the 84-year-old woman from the outside world. But the suspect makes a critical technical error. They completely miss a secondary camera angle hidden near the rear. At 2:12 in the morning, this surviving lens captures the horrifying climax of the silent home invasion. The brief footage reveals an armed individual actively escorting the frail elderly victim out of her own residence. They see a desperate and deeply flawed illusion. She is being forced into the cold darkness at gunpoint. This terrifying window of recorded video confirms the absolute worst fears of the local authorities. The digital blackout was merely the silent prelude to a violent physical abduction. However, when the investigators finally arrive at the property the following morning, the physical evidence tells a completely different story than the clean, silent digital hack. As crime scene technicians process the front porch, they discover clear, undeniable indications of a severe physical altercation. The area shows obvious signs of a desperate physical struggle. Chemical analysis, using forensic luminescent reagents, reveals a significant amount of blood evidence smeared across the concrete steps. The laboratory quickly confirms that the biological material belongs exclusively to the victim. This violent physical reality creates a massive contradiction that instantly complicates the entire investigation. If the masked intruder was sophisticated enough to silently disable a remote medical application and surgically blind, they look at the demand for millions of dollars and confidently declare that the Qi, a smart home network. Why did the actual extraction result in a messy, chaotic, and bloody struggle on the front steps? A professional operative, capable of executing a flawless digital breach, would ideally neutralize their target quietly and transport them without leaving a massive forensic footprint right outside the front door. The blood evidence proves that the suspect lost complete control of the operation the exact moment they had to physically interact with the victim. The clinical precision of the midnight hack completely fell apart during the 212 extraction. The authorities are left staring at a crime scene that feels like it was orchestrated by two entirely different people. The digital evidence points heavily to a silent, calculating phantom who perfectly understands complex coding and hidden network vulnerabilities. The physical evidence points directly to a clumsy, aggressive amateur who somehow allowed their 84-year-old victim to put up a violent fight on the front porch. How can one singular suspect possess the supreme intelligence to easily bypass an encrypted medical